Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about a plane that I think it's overlooked a little bit in the grand scheme of American fighter aircraft during the Second World War. When you think of iconic American fighters, you probably think of planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, the F-4F Wildcat and F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and of course the P-51 Mustang. All of these very iconic for one reason or another, yet we've left out the plane that was actually the third most produced American fighter in World War II, just behind the P-47 and P-51. And that plane is the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, first flown back in October 1938 as a derivative of the Curtiss P-36 Hawk. The then XP-40 was an attempt to fit an Allison V-1710 onto the P-36 frame. Initially, while the V-1710 offered greater performance due to reduced drag in it being an inline engine instead of a radial engine, the actual performance of the XP-40 was pretty disappointing. This was, at least in part, due to the fact that the oil cooling radiator was located just under fuselage, right behind the wing. To boost performance, the radiator was eventually moved to just under the nose, giving the XP-40 a rather large chin, or maybe a little mouth. It was with this general configuration that in 1939, the P-40 would begin its 5-year production run, flying all over the world and serving in just about every theater of the war, and flying with most major Allied powers. The P-40 ended up being a very common plane during the Second World War, but it is perhaps more forgotten about, at least comparatively speaking, due to its just decent performance. The most remembered aircraft are often the most exceptional ones, the exceptionally good and the exceptionally bad. And while the P-40 was technically inferior to a lot of Axis mainline fighters in the war, it's also not as if the P-40 was terrible. It had solid, if unspectacular, top speed. It flew pretty well, it was pretty easy to produce, and it was overall reliable. Now, it didn't perform well at high altitudes, it didn't have an amazing armament, and it wasn't as agile as something like the Zero, but still it was a perfectly fine aircraft, a real jack-of-all-trades and master of none. But due to it being inferior in some manner or another to comparable Axis aircraft, the P-40 would see a good many attempted improvements through its career, from having stronger weapons, to a stronger engine, to reworking the frame itself, but ultimately the P-40 never really advanced past being a jack-of-all, master-of-none. Well aware of the fact that aviation technology was rapidly evolving in the pre-World War II and World War II era, and before America ever became a direct participant in the war, but just after the war started, Curtiss-Wright would embark on a journey to build the successor to the P-40. The end result of that journey is our subject for today, a plane that was constructed in the midst of a downward spiral of Curtiss-Wright. This is the Curtiss P-60, along with the XP-46 and XP-53. The story of the P-60 starts in 1939, roughly around the beginning of World War II, with men from Curtiss-Wright over in Europe observing the modern fighters of European countries, planes like the Supermarine Spitfire and Messerschmitt Bf-109. Taking note of their designs, their armaments, and their performance, the men from Curtiss-Wright would send back some suggestions for improving the performance of the P-40. They took note that the Spitfire and Bf-109 were both smaller than the P-40. It was slightly larger than the Spitfire, and actually a good bit larger than the Bf-109. And they would also note that the pair of 50 cal machine guns on the early P-40s, sometimes complemented with two 30 cal machine guns, was still overall inferior to the minimum 8 303 cal machine guns that was seen on the Spitfire, and that armament was maybe on par with the guns found on some of the BF-109 variants. So with these things in mind, an advancement on the P-40 would begin designing in September 1939, and by September 29th, a contract for 2 prototypes would be issued. This new design, dubbed the XP-46, was largely to resemble the P-40, just a little bit smaller and cleaner overall, measuring 9.19 meters long, 10.46 meters wide, and 3.07 meters tall. The XP-46 was half a meter shorter and almost a full meter more narrow. The XP-46 would retain the Allison V1710 engine, but it would use a more powerful version called the V171039, with 1,150 horsepower. This would compare to the roughly 1,000 horsepower of the earlier Allison engines. It was also to be fit with automatic leading edge slots that would improve performance near a stall, and the armament was to be significantly increased, up to 2 50 cal machine guns in the nose and 8 30 cal machine guns in the wings. Factoring in the increase in weight from the additional guns, and also the increased power from the new engine, Curtiss-Wright was rather optimistic, and predicted that a speed of 410 miles an hour at 15,000 feet was within the realm of possibility. But damaging this possibility was an addition to the specification shortly thereafter, where additional armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were to be included. Still though, Curtiss-Wright was optimistic about their design. First flying in February 1941, the top speed of the XP-46, with some weight added to simulate a full armament load, was well below what they anticipated, sitting at 355 miles an hour at 12,200 feet. While this was well below what was anticipated, it wasn't actually terrible performance, and factoring in the increase in armament, the XP-46 was probably a little bit better than the existing P-40A, B, and C models. However, because the performance wasn't a major improvement over the P-40, the US military elected to reject the XP-46, and instead the P-40 would be fit with that stronger Allison engine, starting in the P-40D model. Actually, in fact, even before the XP-46 would fly, sometime in mid-1940, the US military already rejected the XP-46 design, in an effort to not disrupt production lines and keep the P-40s flowing. The rather disappointing performance once it actually did fly only cemented this decision. So thus the production and use of the P-40 would continue, and Curtiss-Wright's first attempt to replace it ended in a disappointing failure. However, this failure didn't seem to actually deter Curtiss-Wright, and after the XP-46 was rejected in mid-1940, but before it first flew, Curtiss-Wright was already working on another potential successor to the P-40 in the XP-53. This model is easily the shortest-lived of all 3 of the potential successors we're talking about today, as the prototype for it was never even completed. They were in the process of making some, but they were never actually completed as the XP-53. With the rejection of the XP-46, Curtiss-Wright would then propose later that year that the frame of an XP-46 or P-40D be altered to fit 8 50 cal machine guns and a 1,600 horsepower Continental I-1430, a so-called hyper engine, the same engine that was used on the XP-67 Moonbat, that also kept catching on fire and failed to reach its projected power output. Suffice it to say, as the Continental engine was a complete failure, the XP-53 design would never come to fruition. But while the dream for the XP-53 was still alive as it was anyway, the U.S. Army Air Corps would go to Curtiss-Wright with a request. They wanted a fighter that had both a laminar flow wing, where air passes more smoothly over the wing, thus boosting performance, and it would have a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. As the XP-53 had a laminar wing, Curtiss-Wright elected to forego constructing a second prototype as the XP-53, and instead, it would be redesignated the XP-60 and fit with a Rolls-Royce Merlin. And ultimately, due to the failure of the Continental Hyper engine, the other XP-53 frame in progress was then too converted over to the XP-60 to be used as another test frame. Measuring in at 10.34 meters long, 12.6 meters wide, and 3.28 meters tall, the XP-60 went away from the general philosophy of the XP-46, in wanting a smaller overall frame to reduce weight and increase speed and maneuverability. As construction of the XP-53 frames were already underway, it wouldn't be long until the XP-60 was ready to take to the air in September 1941, and while it performed moderately well with a top speed of 380 miles an hour, that wasn't exactly spectacular or anything, and the top speed would have to be significantly increased for the XP-60 to succeed and disrupt the P-40 production lines. And even then, there was a problem that would be a sign of things to come for the project. The Merlin engine was a highly sought-after engine, and for very good reason. And because of that, there were major doubts that the XP-60 project, when and even if it made it into production, would actually be able to receive enough of these engines to keep their production lines flowing. Therefore, a different engine would be needed, and so it was decided that the Allison V-1710 would make a triumphant return, this time a stronger variant with a supercharger. This new aircraft was to be designated the P-60A, and on October 31st, 1941, an order for 1,950 P-60As was placed by the Army. And it finally seemed like Curtiss-Wright had a successor to the P-40 on its hands, until about 1 month later, back at Curtiss-Wright HQ, further studying of the P-60A design with the Allison engine would reveal to them that the projected performance would be quite lower than what the Army was anticipating. With this information then relayed to the Army, that production contract was then promptly cancelled, and Curtiss-Wright was now in a very awkward spot. With no successor to the P-40 in development at the moment, the Army would then go to Curtiss-Wright and politely suggest that if they weren't going to have a new design that significantly improved upon the P-40, then maybe, perhaps, they should start producing the P-47 Thunderbolt under contract with Republic. Likely not wanting to admit defeat, but still being in a very rough spot right now, Curtiss-Wright would agree to a bit of a compromise. They would be on the hook to produce 2,400 P-47s, along with an additional 1,400 P-40s, and in a move that could be called experimentation or covering your bases, or perhaps just flailing wildly, desperate to find something that gets accepted and gets a contract. They would also be producing 3 XP-60 variants, each of them with a different engine setup. The first of these variants would be the XP-60A, to remain outfitted with the Allison V-1710, but with a General Electric turbocharger. The second variant would be the XP-60B, Also with the Allison engine, but with a Wright turbocharger. The third variant would be the XP-60C, and it would be the largest departure yet, with a Chrysler XIV 2220 engine with an estimated 2,500 horsepower. This engine is a rather interesting one in that it was Chrysler's first so-called Hemi engine, a nickname given to engines with hemispherical cylinder heads. Such an arrangement offers overall greater engine power, but also suffers in the realm of complexity and cost, with the cylinder heads costing more to machine and produce as a result of their shape. Realistically, because of that complexity and cost factor, this engine would not be used on military aircraft unless its performance was just exponentially greater than your more common engines. But regardless of that, Curtiss-Wright would never actually see if the performance of the Chrysler engine was that much better, as the XP-60C model would never have that engine installed. While it did offer significant power and was an aerodynamic inline engine, not only would there be anticipated issues in acquiring the resources necessary to make them, the engine itself was actually quite large, both in size and weight. Weighing 2,430 pounds, the Chrysler engine was a good 1,000 pounds heavier than the Allison engine, and nearly 1,000 pounds heavier than the Merlin. Additionally, the Chrysler engine was a whopping 122 inches long, whereas the Allison was about 86 inches and the Merlin was about 88. This significant difference in size and weight meant that the nose and fuselage of the XP-60C would have to be altered quite a bit, with them needing to find ways to stretch out the nose and balance out the weight properly. Ultimately, Curtiss-Wright would go with a much simpler option, and selected the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. This engine would also require some alterations to the nose, but not nearly as much as the Chrysler engine would require. And all the while this deliberation on the XP-60C's engine was going on, the XP-60A with the Allison engine would be completed, and would be near flight testing in October 1942. In some initial taxiing tests, though, the turbocharged Allison engine proved to be very troublesome, and it caught on fire several times, damaging the frame and delaying the actual flight testing. To fix the issue, they simply decided to remove the problem. That turbocharger was just taken out, and in November 1942, the XP-60A would take to the air for the first of a handful of test flights. Now, it would only have a handful of test flights, though, as the performance was rather middling. Lacking the turbocharger, they could only estimate that the top speed would be around 420 miles an hour at high altitudes. Certainly not a bad top speed, but it was an estimated top speed, and it was likely overestimated, but also compared to what would come in planes like the P-51D and later model P-47s, the performance was comparatively disappointing. As a result, after a few test flights, the XP-60A would be retired, and it would be scrapped for spare parts to help keep the other XP-60 projects running. Even with the failure of the A model, the C model switching over to the R2800 engine breathed a bit of life into the project, and the Army was once again interested in it. Promising better performance with that radial engine, the Army would place an order for 500 of the radial-powered P-60s, to be officially designated as the P-60A1. However, in an effort to boost performance and also make the whole process more annoying, the official P-60A1 design would utilize specific R2800 engines that would enable the use of contra-rotating propellers. Around the time the order was placed, though, Pratt & Whitney didn't really have enough R2800s with that contra-rotating system. And so in the meantime, while the XP-60C would just sit around and wait for one of these engines to be delivered, the XP-60B model was also just kind of sitting around, waiting. And so that one would be taken and altered to fit a more typical R2800 engine, with just a single 4-bladed propeller. With the design alteration on the XP-60B, it was then renamed to the XP-60E. Not the XP-60D though, as the D designation was already taken by the original XP-60 design that received an update, and it was now fit with an American-made Merlin engine in the Packard V1650. Now, if all of this sounds a little bit confusing with the letter designations and engine swaps and engine problems and all of that, that's because it really kind of is, and trying to keep all of this in line is a little annoying. That's why I said earlier that the XP-60A, B, and C production agreement was like Curtiss-Wright just sort of flailing wildly. The whole saga of the XP-60 gets more and more tangled and weird as you go. Adding to that weirdness, even though there were doubts that they could get the R2800 with the contra-rotating propeller system, thus necessitating the creation of the XP-60E, the XP-60C with that system would actually be the first radial-powered XP-60 to fly on January 27, 1943. With this contra-rotating propeller system, its performance was actually relatively decent, hitting a top speed of 414 miles an hour at roughly around 20,000 feet. This was lower than the estimated top speed of the XP-60A, but considering that Curtiss-Wright had a slight history of overpromising a la the XP-46, the performance here of the XP-60C was still solid. However, this solid performance came with a couple caveats though, in that with the R2800 engine, the armament had to be reduced in an effort to save weight, going from 8 50 cal machine guns down to just 4, and the range was pretty mediocre, sitting somewhere between 315 miles and 615 miles. Basically, it had reduced offensive potential, mediocre range, and speed that was still less than planes like the P-51 and P-47. When the XP-60E with the single prop would take to the air later that year, in May 1943, the top speed was slightly worse, sitting at 410 miles an hour, but that was not the biggest issue that they had. The much bigger problem at hand was that during its first flight, the engine would just abruptly fail, and the plane had to crash land. To repair it, things get even more confusing now, as parts from the XP-60A, including its wings, were then put on the XP-60E, and the contra-rotating propeller engine on the XP-60C was removed and put into the XP-60E, and then the XP-60E was renamed to the XP-60C. All of this was completely for naught, though, and by June 3, 1943, the initial order for 500 P-60A1s was officially revised down to just 2, the 2 planes that were in the process of being built at the time, and when they were completed, they would receive the name of YP-60E. These would differ a little bit from the XP-60E though, having 6 50 cal machine guns and a bubble-style canopy, but still that did absolutely nothing to save the project, and the Army was not interested in this plane anymore. Still, for some reason, the Army requested that the YP-60s undergo flight testing regardless. For what reason, I'm not sure. Maybe they were punishing Curtiss-Wright. And when they did fly, in mid-July 1944, their performance was about on par with the XP-60E, and as a result, the project was then abandoned shortly thereafter. But somehow the P-60 did have one last hurrah, though, as one of the XP or YP-60E frames somehow managed to avoid being scrapped, and it would appear at the 1947 Cleveland National Air Races as a participant. In the qualifying stage, it crashed. And thus so ends the confounding and annoying saga of the XP-60 and the attempted replacements of the P-40. Past this series of failures, Curtiss-Wright as a company increasingly lost ground in the aircraft production market, and past 1943, the only design of theirs to really get footing was the SC Seahawk, a scout seaplane. By 1948-49, Curtiss-Wright elected to get out of the aircraft production business entirely, selling their aircraft production assets over to North American Aviation. But in some way, though, Curtiss-Wright would have the last laugh, as the company actually still exists today as Curtiss-Wright. While North American does also still exist in some regard, it is part of another company and does not exist under that name anymore. But with what happened to Curtiss-Wright late in World War II and just throughout 1940, the XP-60 was just indicative of some of their larger issues, their failure to maintain their presence in the industry, through either poor design decisions or just poor luck, and desperately trying to stop their decline. And in their desperation, they made a really confusing and just annoying plane in the XP-60. Therefore, I say good riddance. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. To be honest, I was almost hesitant to do this video on the P-60 just because of the switching and ever-evolving names and designations. At some point, you just have to look at Curtiss-Wright and just ask, why are you doing this? Just stop it. The plane has not been accepted for production yet, and you've already got 50 different versions of it. Just knock it off. Curtiss-Wright needed to just chill. Once the plane was in production, then you can make a bunch of different variants. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.